Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today on the new development environment and what it means for your company. Joining us today is Chad Williams from Innovia Consulting. And before I pass it over to Chad, I would like to remind you that this session is being recorded and it will be posted to our on-demand webinar library later this week for you to review and share. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box. We will get them answered at the end of our session. So now I will pass it on to Chad to kick off our presentation.
All right, thank you, Angie, and good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Chad Williams. The slide will advance. I am our CEO here at Innovia Consulting. I lead our NAV delivery team. My background is software engineering, and I have been working with NAV for a little over 15 years. So our goal today here is to talk a little bit and give you some exposure to the new development environment. So our agenda, first of all, I'll talk a little bit about what this means for your company. And then I'm going to really dive into helping you get started. So the goal here is to give you an overview of the things you're going to need to learn. Where do you start? And then I'm going to share some lessons that we have learned. I'm going to go through a demo, so I'm going to actually build an extension and deploy that out. So hopefully when you walk away from this, you'll have some basis to get started with. And certainly if you have any questions, you can always send them over our way, and I'd be happy to help. So let's jump into it. So what does this mean for your company? So today, if you're working with an older version of NAV or BC, Microsoft obviously rebranded the product to be BC now. So if you hear me say NAV or BC, it's all the same. I am myself still getting used to the new naming. But with the release of Business Central back in April is when these changes started to come out. And so today, if we're going to modify your environment, we modify the environment directly. So if you're going to add fields to the item table or add fields to the customer table, as you know, if you are experienced in developing in NAV today, you go and modify those objects directly. So the biggest change that is coming is that we will no longer be doing this. So Microsoft is fundamentally changing the architecture by which we modify the system. And the reason for doing that is, as many of you know who have been through upgrades in the past, is that upgrades are sometimes painful, they're expensive, they take a lot of time. And so what Microsoft is doing is changing the platform by which we modify the system to make that easier, so that in the future our upgrades are easier, and to allow for the Business Central SaaS, or software as a service option that was released last April, where now Microsoft actually manages those updates, and on a monthly basis, updates are pushed out to your tenant, and twice a year, major updates are pushed out. So the big change is that in order to allow for that, we can no longer modify those objects directly. So how do we do that going forward? We modify them indirectly by using what are called extensions and events. And that is really the goal here today, is to explain to you what those are and how we do that. The other thing that's changing is the development environment. So today we work in CAL, in that classic seaside development environment. That is officially going away, and that language will now be called AL. So, and as I already alluded, the environment is changing, so that seaside environment is changing to Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a very light framework, and I will show you that and talk more about that in a bit. So this is happening. So I did this session at our customer conference a few weeks ago, and this note here read that the CAL development environment will go away. Not sure yet, but very soon. Since then, 2 weeks ago, we were at our Microsoft Partner Conference called Directions, where we learned that this major release that came out last month, what they are calling the April release of Business Central, is the last release that will have the CAL development and the seaside development environment. If you're working with Business Central SaaS that was released last April, a little over a year ago, this is the only option, is to modify it through extensions and events and using the new AL. So it's coming. So in the end, that is the only option once we get past these versions. So what does that mean to you as a company? So whatever modifications you've got, and I have, in 15 years, I've yet to see a database without any modifications. So those modifications will need to be rewritten, converted from CAL to AL, and moved into extensions. So there are utilities out there to do this. There is some refactoring that will need to be done because of the fact that you can no longer modify an object directly. So if you think of the sales posting process, if you had a modification embedded in the middle of that sales posting process, there's going to be some refactoring to try to figure out how to rework that modification to tie into events, which again, I'll talk about here in a bit, to make that modification work. So for those of you that have been around in the nav world for a long time and have been through the 2009 RTC transformation years, I would say that this is a much smaller transition. It is not as big. Not that it's going to be super simple, but there are some things that aren't. It's just not as big of a switch as some of the things we saw with the RTC, where there was a lot of rewrite that need to be done throughout the system. So those are some of the impacts and the reasoning for this discussion today. So what do you need to learn? So there's a few key terminology here that we need to discuss. So the first one being extension. So extension is a little confusing because Microsoft uses this term in two different places. One, an extension is the overall modification. You'll also hear it referred to as an app, which I think an app is the most intuitive term for it, because you think of apps on your phone, it's very similar. So it's a self-contained modification. It's bundled into an extension or an app, and then I take that and I install it onto my Business Central environment, and then my environment, I will see those changes. So if I made changes to the item and added a few fields, I can install that extension and then I will see that. And that's actually the example we'll go through here in a little bit. The term extension is also used as it relates to objects. So as I said earlier, you no longer modify objects directly. So there are a few new object types of modifications that you make, one of them being what's called a table extension. You're extending the functionality of an existing table. There's also page extensions. So it's just a little confusing because you can hear the terminology used in two different ways. So just be aware that extension is used to refer to the overall app or package of modifications, but it's also used to describe an object when you are extending its functionality, when you extend the table, for example, and you create a table extension. And again, we'll go through an example of that, so it makes a little bit more sense. Next, obviously the AL language. So we need to understand what are the differences in this new language. Is it a big change? What does that mean to us? We need to understand what VS Code or Visual Studio Code is and how we're going to use it. Obviously, as it really has always been, we need to understand the base application. We need to understand Business Central or nav in the past, as we could make modifications without knowledge of the application. I will say that's a risky spot to be in. So here at Innovia, our developers have always had a good, solid understanding of the application. They work with our application consultants to make sure that we are modifying the system in a proper way. So, it's just a call out that it is still important to understand how the base application works when you modify it. And then, so this last one here may seem a little odd. I've got CAL nav. So this is really just a gap in what we have, and it's quickly closing. So when Microsoft released a year ago, there was no way to see the base code in the new environment, in the new VS Code in the AL language. I could see some very generic definitions of objects, but I couldn't get and really dig into the code. So if I needed to make a modification, I still kind of had to be able to read CAL, go back into nav in the classic development environment and look at the code to understand what I needed to do. So Microsoft is working on this. They're basically going to convert the whole base application to a base app that your extension will work with. And in doing so, you'll be able to view the excuse me, view the source code in AL and then be able to understand where your mods should lie. But that's still kind of a work in progress. I expect that to be complete. They talked about some things that are in the April release. To be honest with you, I haven't tested those yet, so I can't really speak to, have they really closed that gap yet or not. But I expect if they haven't, that to happen by this fall's release. So those are a few of the things you need to learn. So where do we get started? So you need an environment to work with first. You're going to need a database. As you know today, you need a database to work against at a Business Central environment. So you have a couple of options out there, and I'll walk through these. So this first one at the top, Dynamics 365 Business Central Sandbox. This is just a subscription, a trial subscription that you can sign up to. So if you go to Microsoft's website, search for Business Central, there is a landing page, and there's a link right there where you can start a trial. It'll spin up an environment, and I think it's a 30-day trial after that. It's going to want to ding a credit card, but you can use that, and it's a decent place to get started. It is one option. I think some of these other ones are better, but let's walk through all of them. If you're already running Business Central SaaS, you have what's called a customer sandbox, part of your subscription already. And what Microsoft did with this April release is add a lot of functionality to that, where I can have multiple sandboxes, and I can also have sandboxes with different versions. So if I wanted to test against a release coming this fall, I will be able to do that in a couple of months. So that customer sandbox is part of your tenant and can be used for this as well. If you're already, if you're in the position where, yeah, I'm already on Business Central, I started there, but I want to understand how I can do some of this development myself, this might be a good spot for you. Next, we have the Docker Sandbox. So what Microsoft has done here, so I'm not going to go super deep into Docker, but to give you kind of an idea what it is. So if you think of virtualized machines or a VM, Docker is kind of a subset of a VM. So a VM is meant to virtualize kind of an entire server. Docker is meant to virtualize yet another subset of a server to make it a smaller container, but allow it to kind of run in its own isolated environment. So what these Docker sandboxes are basically PowerShell scripts that Microsoft has built that will basically tap into. So if you have an Azure subscription, you can basically feed some parameters about your subscription into these scripts. And then what these scripts will do will basically go through and run and build this whole environment for you. So it'll build the Azure VM, it'll set up Docker on the VM, it'll set up Business Central inside that Docker container, it'll set up the web client, it'll set up the web services, it'll set up all of the clients, all the links, all the URLs, everything you need. And it actually, when it's done, it'll bring you to kind of a landing page that'll allow you to just quickly get into it. So this has actually been a very handy one for us, and one I would recommend if you're looking to just get started. This is actually a really nice option, and one that we used a year ago to get started. As you start to scale, if you've got multiple developers that are trying to work, this might not be the best for our needs. We've actually scaled on to something different, but to get started, this works really good, and I'll talk even further about some of the benefits of that option. You also have manual deployment. So if you want to use kind of this Docker approach, but you don't want to deploy it on an Azure VM, you can install that on a virtual machine on premise as well. And so that's what this first manual option is. And then finally, I'm going to call it a traditional setup, but you can still set up Business Central the same way you have installed Nav in the past. If you've got a SQL server to host the database, you can put that there. If you've got a server for the service tier, you can install the Business Central service tiers, the admin console, the PowerShell scripting, all of that's still there for you to use. So you can still go and set it up if you've got some virtual machines or physical servers on premise that you want to use, or if you've got something in Azure, you can do that too. And if you want to just have full control over the deployment. So those are some of the options. So let's compare some of these a little further. So again, the first two, the Business Central sandboxes, those are both going to be hosted by Microsoft. So what that means is Microsoft's going to handle those updates. So when the patches come out each month and when the major releases come out, they're automatically going to be pushed to your environment, which in the instance of a dev environment might not actually be what you want. You may want some more control over that. The other limitation here is that this middle column, access to source. So as I talked about earlier, as things kind of exist now, you need to have some ability to actually get back into the old classic development environment and to be able to look at that source code. In these environments, those top two, you don't have that back-end access. In fact, you can't even get to the SQL database because it's just software as a service. So you're not going to have access to that source, at least as it is today, as Microsoft, as I talked earlier about, as Microsoft fills that gap that could change. The cost of each of those, the first one, it's just a separate trial subscription that you've got. Again, I think it's a 30-day trial and then you're going to have to pay for it. The second option, that's part of your Business Central subscription that you're paying for already. Now, I will note that with the enhancements they made in April, where you can create multiple sandboxes, I see Microsoft wanting to monetize that somehow. I don't see them giving you kind of an infinite number of sandboxes for the cost or for your regular subscription rate. So I suspect they're going to tag something on there, but at this point in time, I don't believe they have anything. And so that first one, really, demo, you could do some development with it. It's going to be tough. The customer sandbox, I've got it marked just as a test, but I think as I've learned in a little bit more about features that Microsoft just released, that could actually work as a dev environment, especially as Microsoft fills that gap in how we look at the source code. And then the bottom two options here, the Docker Sandbox and the manual deployment. The Dockers, both of those, you're going to have control over those. So you can host them. I've got in your Azure, because of course we're always pushing folks to, encouraging folks to move to Azure. But if you've got on-prem servers, you can do the manual deployment on an on-prem server. In these instances, because you're managing those, you manage the updates, so you've got a little bit more control over that. Another benefit of that Docker Sandbox is that Microsoft will publish new updated containers with each release. So if you're looking to kind of keep your environment current, but you want the control over it, that Docker Sandbox does make that a little quicker for you, because again, those containers are published out by Microsoft, and you can just pull those down, and they're easy to drop into that VM that it's set up initially, and then you can run the new latest and greatest with just a few PowerShell scripts that will run through that. In both of those worlds, you have full access to the source, so I can run the classic development environment. I can get in there, I can look at the database, I can do whatever I need to do. And the cost of those, it's going to be for that Docker Sandbox, it's going to be the cost of that Azure VM. It is a very small Azure VM. I couldn't tell you exactly the cost, but it's all on one VM. It's fairly lightweight. And again, manual deployment, the cost is going to be however you set that up. If you do it on premise, if you've got the servers, you've got those available to use. If you're going to put it on Azure, you've obviously got to pay for those resources. And these environments work very well for both a dev and test environment. All right, so now that we've got an environment, setup that we can work with, let's dive into the development environment. So what do I need to do to start developing if I've got one of these? So the first thing I need is I need to get Visual Studio Code. It's a free download. Search for Visual Studio Code. It's a very lightweight download and install. So if you're used to installing Visual Studio in the past and just how long that might take, I remember days of hours, if not a whole morning or afternoon, waiting for a new version of Visual Studio to install. It's much simpler. It'll install in likely a few minutes. It's really a glorified text editor, and that really leads to the next point. So Visual Studio Code is meant to work with a lot of different languages, and if you're familiar with installing Visual Studio in the past, you know that you could install different aspects of it. So if you were only ever going to work with C# development, you could disable VB and not install it, and it wouldn't install all of the libraries and everything that go with it, so that Visual Studio understood what VB was and would let you build VB projects. So in Visual Studio Code, it's somewhat similar, but it's a much lighter framework. So what gives Visual Studio Code its ability is actually extensions. So extensions is not a term used just for Business Central and Nav, is a term that's been used widely in software to be used to extend that functionality. So what I can do in Visual Studio Code is I install extensions into Visual Studio Code so what I have to do is install what's called the AL extension language, which will tell Visual Studio Code how to interpret the AL, how to compile it, how to debug it, how to package it into an extension or app that I can then publish into my environment. So that's a very lightweight extension that I will need to install. So once I've installed that, now my Visual Studio Code environment is aware of what AL is, and it'll let me build things with it. So the main area in Visual Studio Code, so all the functionality is based around the concept of a command palette. So when I open it in a little bit, you're going to see there's not a ton of menus. There's not a lot of buttons all over the place like you would see in Visual Studio. It's really driven from a central command palette is where all of the power comes from. So to bring up that command palette, simple shortcut there, Control-Shift-P. And so in this example here, because I've installed the AL extension language, there's going to now be a suite of commands in the command palette that are as a result of installing the AL extension language. And the first in one here is this one. It's called AL Go, exclamation point. And what that does is it'll actually build the shell or the start, give you a starting point of your first extension. It's just a simple hello world extension, but it gives you the starting point and configures everything for you so you can get started relatively quickly. So when I do that Control-Shift-P, select AL Go, what that's going to do is it's going to build the folder and the necessary files for it, which are very few, and you'll see that in a little bit. It's going to need to connect to my environment. So the reason we first got you set up with an environment is you have to have something to develop against. And so you will specify the connection to your environment, the password, that type of stuff, so the username and password, so that it can connect to your environment. The next thing it'll do is it's going to need to download what are called symbols. So basically what symbols do is describe to Visual Studio Code and to your extension what the base application looks like. So it gives it a point of reference for which to modify against. And I'll dive a little bit more into that a little later. So once you've downloaded those symbols, you're basically ready to go and you can start writing code. And then just a note here, there are a lot of great videos out on the Learning Portal on Customer Source. If you have access to that, that will go into all of this in a greater depth and help you get started as well. So once you've got the development environment, now you've got to understand a little bit about the AL language. So now I've done my AL Go project. I've got a base set up here, but I have no idea what AL is. I don't know what the syntax is, so how do I get started? So the syntax is really very similar to the CAL. Microsoft's done a nice job of keeping many of the keywords the same. I think you're going to find that it has a lot of the resemblances, so it's not going to be a big learning curve. And if you've been a developer for a while, I think one of the things that developers are very good at is that programming is programming, and jumping into a new language, it's just a different syntax, but generally it's not that big of a transition. And I would say that this is even a smaller transition than if you were a C# developer and then somebody laid VB code in front of you and you kind of had to look at it and go, okay, well, I kind of understand what's going on here because I know enough of the basic structures and building blocks that are here. Because at the end of the day, every language has a lot of the exact same tools. So one of the really neat things here, though, that is different is so everything is defined in code. So in the C-side development environment, I'm sure you're used to, and you probably do it today without even thinking about it, but all of the different windows and properties, everything is in all these different little windows you've got to navigate to. And if you're not in the right spot, when you hit properties, you don't get what you're looking for. Or if you're trying to drill into the filter on a table relation, you've got to go through all these windows. So over the years, we've all just gotten used to it and you don't really think about it anymore. You're just used to doing that. But one of the things I noticed right away when I got into this is I don't have to do that anymore. If I need to define a variable, I just define the variable in the code there. I don't have to go find it and dig through the menus. I don't have to, if I'm going to specify a property, I can just specify the property where it belongs. I don't have to, click through all the buttons. So I think from that standpoint, it speeds up development. It also makes it easier to replicate, as I've got below. Not that it has been difficult to copy things in the past. Between those windows, it's very simple to just copy text and move things around, and so I think that speeds things up as well. So once you get into it and you start using it, again, as you can see here, I don't think you're going to want to go back. As we've seen with our developers, obviously we have to support many different versions that our customers are running. And as the developers over the last year have gotten into this, a lot of them are like, how can we get all of our customers to this? Because I don't want to work in the old stuff anymore. So I think you're going to find the efficiencies that it can bring. And then just things like snippets and other things that we've had in Visual Studio for years, to now have those. So if I'm going to create a new object, I don't just start typing it from scratch. I use a snippet. It gives me everything. I just fill in the key information that I need to change. So again, it just speeds up the development cycle. All right, and then extensions and events, and I think we'll be diving in. I think this is my last slide, and we'll dive into the demo. So again, this is the only way to modify Business Central SaaS. So if you're on that environment that came out last April, it's the only way. If you are running on-prem and you anticipate running on-prem for a while, if you're not going to upgrade, you can avoid this for a while. But at some point, when an upgrade comes into your future, you're going to have to cross this bridge. And if you're somebody who's looking at upgrading this fall to the current release, that's going to be the time to do it. So, so again, let me talk a little bit further about what's actually in an extension. So again, the extension is that container. It's the app that contains the modifications. So I have AL files. That's the actual code. So the .al is the file syntax, the file extension, excuse me, that's used. I can put multiple objects in one AL file. I can have one object per AL file, and I'll talk about some of that in the lessons learned. Symbols, as I said earlier, symbols describe to the extension what the base application looks like. So it tells it, what's in the base item table, what's in code unit 80, the sales posting code unit, what does the item card page look like, those types of things. There are two then what are called JSON files here. Those are setting files. One file describes what the extension is to the world. The other file is used just in debugging and deploying to your development environment and testing. and I'll show you both of those. I can also have dependencies in between extensions. So if I have extension A that is dependent on extension B, I would have extension B in my extension A here so that it knows what's in that one. So I can have other extensions in there, and then I can have other miscellaneous files. You'll see when I get into ours, I've got an image file in there, and some other things. But that's the bulk of what's in an extension. And finally here, events. So this is a little bit of a mind shift for developers. So today, if you're going to modify the sales posting process, as you know, you might spend the majority of your development time just trying to find the right spot to insert your modification. That stays largely the same, although it's a little differently, because you can't modify those code units directly anymore. You now have to subscribe to events that Microsoft publishes in different areas throughout the base application. So you still have to kind of identify, okay, here's where I need to make my change, but I can't modify this directly. So now I got to look to the events that happen either just before or just after where I need to make my change to figure out how to tap into that functionality. And you're going to find that in some cases, events are not going to exist there, and you're not going to be able to do the mod the same way. You're going to have to rework that or come up with a different way. Microsoft is adding events to the base application constantly. You can request events to be added to Microsoft, and they're pretty good about adding those unless it's just something off the wall. They will do that. So just in the last year, they've added hundreds of events to the system that hopefully will give us the hooks we need into the base application to modify the things as we have done in the past. But there are going to be things that we might not be able to do exactly the same. So, all right, so we're at about our midway point here. So let's jump into the demo. We've had enough of the slides here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna jump onto a remote desktop here. So this is one of our development servers that we have here at Innovia. I'm just going to refresh on my environment here. So I've got Business Central open here. This is not the April release. I did not get to update my environment with the latest release, but for the purposes of our demo, it's going to be exactly the same. So this is a separate database that I've got set up here. So this is actually set up in what I would say was more of a traditional deployment from what I had on those previous slides. So I've got my own Kronos database here. I've got the service tier web service set up. So this is the Business Central web client if you've not seen this yet. And this is the client that will go forward this fall. So that's the environment I am going to develop with. I also already have Visual Studio Code open. So right now I have nothing open. So in Visual Studio, you're used to working with solutions and projects. In Visual Studio Code, you really just work with folders. I mean, it's kind of like a project, but again, the whole idea here is it's just a much lighter weight framework. So instead of having a project with lots and lots of folders and lots of files, you really just have a folder that is your root folder, and then whatever is below that is what's in your extension. And when I create one, you're going to see there's not much to it. It's a couple of 2 folders and a couple of files. So let's just talk quickly about Visual Studio Code before I jump into it. So as you can see here, it is a, there's not much here. I have a few basic menus up at the top that give me kind of your normal functionality that you would have in a Windows application. I've got my edit, those type of things. Because it's a development environment, I have debugger capabilities and debugger commands. But that's really, there's not much there. You also notice the lack of a huge ribbon at the top here with tons of buttons, as you would see in Visual Studio. I'm working my way down the left here. So this first spot here that I have open already is just an Explorer. So I guess the equivalent in Visual Studio would be your Solution Explorer. This is where you can see the files that you're working with. I can see the folders and that whole structure. So when I open something up, you'll see that. This magnifying glass, I have search capability. What would any application be without being able to search and replace and those types of things. Again, being a development environment, it has to be source control aware. So that's what this third menu on the left is. The fourth menu here is the debugger. So again, got to have a debugger in my development environment. And then finally, this last one here are the extensions. So what I have here are the extensions that I have already installed. So I have the AL extension language that I talked about earlier. I've already set this up and installed it. So now my Visual Studio Code is aware of AL and it knows how to build and deploy extensions. You'll notice I've got another one here. This is actually one I've downloaded from the marketplace. This is from Code Ready Software. The benefit of these other extensions, and if I search the marketplace, you'll see here, there's actually a whole bunch of AL extensions out here now. So I've got the one from Microsoft that I need, but then the Business Central community has built a lot of extensions. When I started this a year ago, there was probably 2 or 3 out here, and now you can see that we've got nearly a dozen. And largely what these give you are more snippets. So this AL language from Microsoft has some base snippets in it. And again, those snippets are just starters. So I can pull in a snippet, and rather than typing all this code out, it gives me a starting place. And then I just change the key pieces of information that relate to what I'm developing. So that's what a lot of these will give you, is just additional snippet and different things. So don't hesitate to explore these. As you can see, I've got the one downloaded, and I've been through some of these, but I need to catch up because a lot have come out over the last year that can add just more benefit and increased efficiency to your development. So since I've already got this installed, let's go to that command palette. So as I said earlier, Control-Shift-P will open up the command palette. And you can see here right at the top, because I've used this recently, you'll see that AL go. But if I just type AL, you'll see there's actually a couple of other commands here. So all of these commands were installed as part of this AL language extension. So I'm just going to go through and click through this AL go. So the first thing it's going to do is it wants to save my folder somewhere. So I'm just going to give it this default location and hit enter. And so what it's doing is it's just real quickly here building the base structure of my extension. The next thing it needs, so again, as I said earlier, it needs to know what to connect to. It needs to have an environment to work against. So I can do against a cloud sandbox or against my local server. So I'm actually not going to configure this one. I just wanted to show you what you would get. So I'm just going to escape out of this and let it finish. So now I want to talk about the structure of the folder that it created. So I created what was called the AL Project 7 folder. So it essentially created a parent folder and then it put everything underneath it. And that's what I'm seeing on the left here in this Explorer. Right now it has one folder in it and 2 files. The folder is called .vs code, and then I have these 2 files, this JSON and this .al file. In this .vs code file, I have another JSON file. Remember, I have 2 of them. This is my launch.json, and that's the file that's open here on the right. So this is the file that's used just through my development process so that the environment knows what to connect to. So this is where I give it the server information, the instance, authentication. I can also specify, to speed up my development, a startup object type and object ID. So if I always wanted it to open a certain page that I am developing, as I go back and forth, as I write code and then deploy it to test it, I can have it open that for me right away. This other file here, this app.json, as I said earlier, this kind of describes to the world what my extension is. So it has, first of all, a unique ID. It has a name, publisher, there's descriptions. It has a version. I can have my dependencies. I can add a logo, and you'll see that when I open up the demo, what I'm going to work with. I can also specify an object ID range in here that I plan to work with. This does not limit it as you're used to from your licensing standpoint. This is just limiting within this extension what IDs I can work with. So if you know your extension is going to work with a set of IDs, you can kind of set this as a check for yourself just to make sure you're not outside of the bounds of what you anticipated or what you had planned to start with. And then finally, I've got, it creates this hello world.al. So this is it. This is the AL language. This is an example here of a page extension. So if you're used to C# or other languages, the object definition looks much like a function definition in C#. So it has, here is basically a reserved word that it describes what it is. So as I said earlier, here's where extension is used in a different facet. So this is a page extension. It has an ID. So IDs, I didn't even talked about that much. IDs, I've heard a lot of rumors. I think the IDs are going to go away, but I did not hear anything at directions further about that. So I guess we'll see. But you know, Microsoft has removed the licensing restrictions on IDs because they've recognized that it's their licensing model with these object IDs and how you purchase tables and code unit has also led to poor development practices over the years. So I'm not sure exactly where Microsoft's going to go with that, but just a heads up, IDs could go away in the future. My extension, then this is just the name of it. And then I have another word, reserved word extends. So it just tells me what base object am I extending. And so basically what this is a page extension to the customer list page. If you're familiar with nav development, you know we have triggers. So this has an on open page trigger, and it'll just publish this message. And you'll notice here we have one little red squiggly line here that's telling us that this customer list, it doesn't know what it is. And that is because of the symbol file. So the one thing that's not in here are those symbol files. And so if I look at the problems down below here, you'll see it does not know what the customer list is. And that's because this project or this folder here, this extension, does not have the symbols in it yet. Okay, so let me jump over to, I'm just going to open another folder. So I'm going to abandon that one for now, and I'm going to jump into a demo that I've already downloaded the symbols and have some of the basic configuration here. So just in the interest of time, this extension here, so it's called My Demo is the parent folder. You can see here now I've got two folders. I've got my .vs code, and now I've got a .al packages. And in that .al packages, I have two .app files or app files. And these are the symbol files that I downloaded from the client or from my environment that now describe to my extension what it is. And if I flip open the command palette, you'll see there's a command right here, AL download symbols. Once you're connected to your environment, you can click that and it'll download those files for you from the environment. I'm not going to do that here again in the interest of time. You can see I've got my app.json file open here, so you can see where we've got some other things filled in the publisher and so forth. We've got our versioning. You can see here I can actually have a logo on the extension so that when it shows up in the client there, you can see that, and then that's this logo file here. And then finally, I have my launch.json, which has been configured to work against my development environment. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a real simple extension. I'm going to add a few fields to the item table. I'm going to add those fields to the page. 3 of the fields are going to be input parameters, and then the 4th field is going to be based on the calculation based on those 3 input parameters. So what I'm going to do here is I have this little shortcut button here to hit new file, and I'm going to create a file here. So this is going to be my item table extension.al. So I'm going to do here first is create the item table extension. So I mentioned snippets earlier. So whenever you want to use a snippet, all the snippets are prefixed with a T. So if I look at this here, I can, if I just start, so I want to do what's called a table extension. So if I put T and then start typing table extension, I will get the snippets for it. And I have 2 of them, one from the base AL extension that I installed into VS Code, and then I have this CSR one that I showed you earlier that I had also installed. So I'm actually going to use that one because it just speeds up things a little bit. And so you'll see it drops in. So this is the snippet. It gives me a starting place to start with. So I've got a table extension. It needs an ID. So I'm just going to use 50,140. It needs a name. So I'm just going to call it my item tab extension. It extends, and then I have to tell it what base object it extends. So now that I have the symbols installed, now it understands what the base application looks like. So you can see here, now it knows what the item is. And so I can select the item table. So this would be how I would add fields to the item table, or any table for that matter. So then I have one section here of fields. So here's where I would specify any of the new fields I want to add. So again, I can hit T and then type field. And so I'm going to add a field here. So I'm going to use this CRS snippet, and I select that and hit tab. And it'll, again, drop in everything that I need. So it saves me all of the typing of having to do that. So this field is going to be 150,140. It's going to be called outside diameter, and it is a decimal. And so this data classification I'm not going to go into right now because it is a deeper conversation, but I am just going to specify that as customer content. It is part of security and all the different things. So I take my word for it for now that we'll just set to customer content. So there, I have that quickly. I have defined my new field. So rather than typing out my other ones, I'm just going to cheat here and copy the other 3 fields that I need. Paste that. Okay. So now I've added my fields. So the next thing I need to do is add my function to calculate. So I've got these 3 are my input parameters: outside, inside, and diameters and part length. And then based on those values, it'll calculate an estimated weight. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get outside of this field section. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a procedure. So if I do T and start typing procedure, I can get a snippet. And so this is going to be, so this is how I would create I guess in classic environment, you would create a function. So this is where I would have navigated to create a local or global function. I would have had to go to the right menu or the right screen. So here again, I can just do it all in code. So if it's local or global, all I have to do is change or remove local. So I'm going to leave it as local. And then my procedure is going to be called, wait, I can type. And again, in the interest of time, I am just going to copy in the logic for this function. And you'll see here the little red squiggly lines. It doesn't understand what my variable, so this is actually a variable I've created. And so I did that on purpose because I wanted to show you. So here's how I would then define a local variable. So I specify var, and then after that, I just give it the name of my variable, followed by a colon, and then the data type, and this is just a decimal, and a semicolon. So you can see all my red lines are gone, and it compiles. So again, just an example of how I can do all of this inline in code. I don't have to be bouncing around through Windows and so forth. So now, if you're worked with nav development for a while, you're probably anticipating I need to now call this function. So up here, I go back to one of my fields. So now what I'm going to do is I want to create a trigger. So the triggers are, as you know, in current development, on validate and on insert. And so I created my snippet. So it says on what, but if I hit for suggestions here or start typing, you'll see it shows me my 2 options. So I can do on validate and on lookup. I'm going to do on validate, and then in here, I'm just going to call my calculate weight function. So now again, just to show how easily, so I need this to happen on all 3 of these. So I can quickly just bounce through here and copy and paste. And so that takes care of my item table extension. So now I am just going to create the page to show that on the item card. So I'm going to call this my item card extension.al. And again here, going to use my snippets. So this is now a page extension. So T page extension. If I start typing, it'll bring that in. Give it an ID. This is my item card extension, and it extends the item card. All right, so then basically the way this works here is I can add either things to the view or the layout of the page. As you can see here, I have a layout section, or I can add buttons or actions. So I'm not going to add any actions. I could leave this here, but I'm just going to delete it and clean it up. Within the layout, I have to give it a reference point of where I want to place it. So if I go back into my Business Central, I'm just going to open an item card. And what I want to do here is add those fields right to the main tab of the item card right here. So I want to add them after the item category. So I have to give it a reference point of where I want to add those. So what I'm going to do here is there's a command called add last, and then I have to give it an anchor point. And my anchor point is going to be the item. So I'm not going to, that is the group. I just don't have time to go through all of the reasoning and explain all of why I'm doing that, but just take my word for it. But that will add that field to that spot in the page. So now I do field, oops. I'm going to get my snippet, and then I can just type in the name. So I'm going to do in my inside diameter, and it'll fill that in, and we're all set. So I'm, again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to grab my last 3 page fields here, paste those in there, and we're all set. Oh, I had this one, did that one twice. Guess I was supposed to do outside diameter there. Okay, so now I'm going to save that. So now I'm basically ready to go. So now I'm going to just hit Control F5 to debug this. So what it's going to do is it debugs it. It's building the app. You can see it just dropped the .app file in here. This is my extension. This is the file I'd actually take out to my my Business Central tenant and install. And then what it's doing here is then it's also opening the web client for me so that I can go into it. So I had not set it to start up on the item card. I should have done that. But if I navigate here now to the item and go to my bicycle, you'll see here now I've got my new field. So I'll just set the inside diameter to 10, outside to 100, length of 50, and you can see it calculates the estimated weight. You'll notice here that I made the estimated weight is grayed out, so I can't edit that because it's based on these other fields. So I did not call that out, but you'll see here, so here's the estimated weight. So this is on the page extension, you can see here. So again, just an example where I can define the properties right here in code. I don't have to be on just the right line, then go hit the properties button, then scroll through that long list in that page. I can just have it entered here. So I've got editable set to false. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint. That's basically the demo here of just showing you kind of the ins and outs of Visual Studio, how to create an extension and then get that deployed out. So let me pull up the PowerPoint, and I think I've got just 2 slides left here. Okay, so some of the lessons that we've learned over the last year. So I mentioned earlier with those AL files, the naming, or actually I mentioned the being able to put multiple objects in a file. So in the demo I just did, you notice that I put one object in a file, and then I had some naming to it. So I'd highly recommend that you, well, one, I would not put multiple objects in a file. I could create one AL file, dump everything in it, but that's going to be a nightmare to maintain down the road. Also think about the naming of those files and how you go about doing that. Have a mind towards source control. So if you're not using, if you're not used to using source control with nav today, get used to it, start getting into it. One of the great things, I guess I didn't really even speak too much, but is that it's built in now. So in nav, I had to go through some gyrations to work with source control. Today, VS Code is integrated with Git. I can check in my objects. I can do everything I want to do. As you can imagine, the naming and structure of how you do that is going to play into your source control strategy. So just be thinking about that, and I would put some conventions in place. If you work by yourself as a developer for your company, put some things in place for yourself, or if you work with a team, sit down with your team and come up with a strategy around that. Again, object and field IDs, I think Microsoft are going to drop these out, but the reality is right now it's a little bit of a pain to deal with. So in development environment today, I can go and look at the object designer and I know exactly what IDs are being used. That is not so easy today. Our developers have actually built a simple little tool that will help pull the IDs out. But that's a little bit of a challenge. So be aware of that. What we actually did is it sounds old fashioned, but we actually just manually kept track of the IDs we were using in a spreadsheet for a few customers, just because there was no better way when we get started. So I expect that to change. And again, the IDs may just go away at some point. Reports. Reports are not bad. So if you've been through the RTC transformation, that was a big deal with reports. The layout of reports have not changed. It's just the definition of the data set. So it's just a matter of converting the CAL code of the data set to AL. And for the most part, the reports will convert over using the text. There's a utility to convert CAL to AL. And that was actually a webinar I did a few months ago on reports. Be aware of permission sets. If you're adding new tables, you will need to add into your extension an XML file that is a permission set. That was not well documented early on from Microsoft. I think that's better now, but just be aware you can't deploy your extension without permission sets for any new tables that you've added. You can't deploy it and then go add the permission sets later, as we're used to doing today. And then advanced application areas. So Microsoft has isolated all of its functionality into different application areas, and a lot of it got lumped into what they would call an advanced application area, even though it had dependencies with other things in separate areas. So just be aware, one of the early complaints about Business Central was, where did everything go? I can't find some of the stuff I need, especially if you have the full premium license and you're looking to use the full suite, especially if you get into manufacturing and some of the more complex areas. There is a way to enable this. It's not a setting. You actually have to build an extension on that. And so if that's something you're running into, there's documentation out on the web on it, on how to do that, or you can certainly contact us and we can help you with that. And then a couple other ones here. Your deployment, just be aware that the validation and so forth is a little tricky. You'll find that you're going to get different validation errors when you're deploying to your test environment, and everything will be fine, and then you'll try to go publish to a Business Central SaaS environment and you may get different errors. It's getting a lot better, but just be aware that you'll run into some of that. Also, as I mentioned in that app.json, there is versioning, so be aware of the versioning and have a strategy there on how you're going to work with it. In your development environment, it does not matter. I can deploy the same extension multiple times with the same version. However, when I get to the BC SaaS environment, I can't do that. Keep in mind testing. So Microsoft released years ago automated test scripts. If that's not something you've looked to yet, that's really going to be something that's going to be critical as we move to the future. As Microsoft pushes out updates, we're going to need a way to quickly test these things. We can't expect our end users to go through and test the whole environment from scratch every time there's a new update. And then finally, when you're looking at your extensions, you have a lot of options. Much like your AL files, you can put everything in one AL file. You can have the same, you have kind of the same decision to make when it comes to your extension. I can put everything in one extension, or I can separate them. Best practice, I would say, generally speaking in software development, is to isolate your code, right? You want it to make it more repeatable, reusable. It's easier to troubleshoot, maintain, debug in the future. Now, one of the caveats to this that we have recently we've had a lot of discussions with Microsoft at the partner conference, has to do with the table extensions. So the way those are built, when you create a table extension, that table extension I made earlier, it does not physically modify the item SQL table in the SQL database. It adds another table, and then every place that the item table is referenced, now that table has to get joined in. So if you're familiar with SQL, writing SQL queries and the performance impacts of how you might structure a query, you could just imagine if I had an item table with 20 extensions to it, with all 20 of these tables all getting joined in every time the item is there, that could create a performance issue. So keep that in mind. I think our approach is going to be changing in that we're going to container all of our table extensions into one extension, so that we don't end up with that. And Microsoft, we talked with Microsoft at length on what they might do there, but as it is today, that's what we're doing. So that's what I've got today. So I'm sorry we ran right up to 11 o'clock here. So are there any questions?
Thank you, Chad. Yes, we do have some questions. So, do you have recommendations on the folder structure for organizing AL code and extension files?
Uh, so I would go back to the last point that I made there about how how you kind of put, do you put all your apples into one basket, or do you try to separate them? So we have tried to take the approach of separating them so that each extension in and of itself is really not that big. So we have not run into the need to create multiple subfolders within there. You certainly can do that. I've seen some developers that have created folders for, you could separate by object type. You could have items, pages, code units, etc. But so we have not found the need for that yet. Again, largely because we have tried to keep the extensions to an isolated modification, for better or for easier maintenance and troubleshooting and so forth down the road.
Okay, thank you. And this might be a little bit similar to this question. Could you discuss the differences in designing report objects with AL code compared to report writing in SQL Server or SSRS?
Let's see. So I'm not sure exactly where that question's coming from. If it's somebody that's used to writing reporting services reports and asking what it's like to transition from there to Business Central reports, or somebody that's familiar with writing reports in NAV already. So I'm going to answer it as if you don't know what the NAV reports are like today. So the NAV reports today are based on SQL reporting services. So the layout side of the report, if you're used to working in reporting services, is nearly identical. What's different about the two reporting structures is that with the NAV reports, the data set is defined within NAV. In the old environment, it's defined in CAL. In the new AL, I'm going to have a report object that defines that data set. That data set then feeds the report. If you're used to working just in reporting services, you know that your data set is defined by the SQL queries you write and handled there. So in the reporting world within NAV, you're going to work within VS Code to build the data set in AL, and then you're going to have an RDL, the RDLC file, which is the report layout file that you can work with in SQL Report Builder or Visual Studio Code, and that will be virtually the same as that you're used to in reporting services. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. How do you get your field numbers do you look at the object designer to find the next available number?
So again, that's one of the limitations we have right now. So there currently is really no good way to do that. So our developers have built an extension that relies on, there are some system tables or virtualized tables that are buried within the, or kind of hidden, I guess I would say, within the application, that I can show what fields are used and what IDs are there. So we are using that. Before that, we just had to manually keep track of it in Excel. The limitation with that is that I cannot take that, and it will not work in the new environment. So I have to run that in the old RTC client to see those fields. Once that client goes away in October, I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's going to be a good way to go and say, hey, what field IDs have been used on the item table in this database? So that might be another reason to, along with the potential performance impact of separating all your table extensions, that might be another argument to say, I'm going to create one table extension container, if you will, for all of my table extensions. And at least that way, whenever you're adding fields to the item, you're always going back to that same physical AL file in that extension, and they're not all separate all over the place. So yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the, excuse me, one of the biggest challenges we ran into right out of the gate. And like I said, we just reverted to manually tracking that in Excel, and we've moved to a simple utility one of our developers built, but now we're going to be migrating to putting the table extensions in a single extension, at least until Microsoft changes how that works.
All right, thank you, Chad.
Okay, well, thank you again. I'll let Angie wrap up. I just want to remind everybody, you can certainly reach out to me. I believe my email is available here with the recording. So if you have any other follow-up questions, or if I didn't answer any of those quite exactly from where you were coming from, feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to follow up with you or have a conversation. So thank you, everyone, and I'll kick it back to Angie, excuse me.
All right, thank you, Chad, for presenting, and to everyone on today's call, or if you're watching on demand, we thank you for joining us. And as Chad mentioned, please feel free to contact us if you have additional questions that you need to have us help you with. And we do have a few more webinars coming soon. We have one this afternoon at 1 p.m. Central. Gino Pack from Innovia Consulting will be presenting on job queue. And we have John Grant from Innovia Consulting. He will be presenting on best practices when you set up items in your worksheets. And his webinar will be tomorrow, Thursday, May 23rd at 1 p.m. Central. So check out our website for more of our upcoming events, and that's innovia.com/events. And thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon on another Innovia webinar. Have a great day, everyone.